a fantastic panel assembled for somebody who's probably one of the most prominent figures in Irish history, Daniel O'Connell, and we mark the 250th anniversary of his birth, of course, this year. O'Connell, I think, probably vies with Pearse as being the most commemorated, memorialised person in Irish history. 2 streets in Dublin, of course, bear O'Connell's name, one being the main one, and the other one being O'Connell Avenue in Phibsborough. And O'Connell Avenue, actually, in Phibsborough, was actually the very first O'Connell Street in Dublin, but was reduced to the avenue term when O'Connell Street was eventually named in the early 20th century. So our panel is the interest in O'Connell is such that we have such a marvellous crowd here, but also, of course, that we have such a fantastic panel assembled. So each is going to speak in turn, I think, and then we'll have time for questions. And I think we will have a variety of viewpoints expressed on the platform, if not from the crowd. So Dr. Miriam McAuliffe is a historian, lecturer, and director of gender studies at UCD. She's been a regular at Chandler at the festival. I'm delighted to have her back again. Conor McCabe is an author and historian who's currently editing the complete writings of James Connolly. He tells me it's 1 million words, and he has volume 1 down, so I don't know how long he has to go, but good luck with that, Conor. Professor Patrick Geoghegan is a professor of modern history at Trinity College Dublin, and of course he is the author of King Dan, The Rise of Daniel O'Connell. So he knows an awful lot about O'Connell, and we look forward to hearing what all 3 people have to say this morning. So thank you very much. And I'm going to think, Patrick, you're going to go first. Yeah.
Good afternoon, everyone, and it is a pleasure to be here as part of the Dublin Festival of History. And I'd also like to give a very special welcome to Dr. Cormac Leonard, who will be interpreting for us today. And Cormac, I co-supervised Cormac's PhD thesis, and it was a brilliant piece of work, and it's wonderful to have him here today as well. I want to begin with a word that isn't usually associated with Daniel O'Connell, and that word is empathy. When we think of Daniel O'Connell, we usually think of him in terms of his oratory. He was a brilliant speaker. He was able to inspire massive crowds. He was able to capture the imagination and the attention of his audiences. He was someone who was hugely influential in the British Parliament, and Charles Dickens would put down his pencil when he was a parliamentary sketch writer because he'd be so overwhelmed by the power of O'Connell's words. Or we think of O'Connell as the great lawyer, the great legal mind, who was able to stand up to bullying judges, who was able to run rings around opposing councils. But we don't usually think of O'Connell in terms of empathy. And I think that was really his greatest strength. When he talked about the plight of enslaved people in the United States or around the world, he was able to make his audience understand what that oppression was like. He would move his audiences to tears when he would describe the enslaved African-American woman who was pregnant, but who felt no joy in that because she believed that instead of passing on a blessing, she was instead passing on a curse, because the child could be taken off her and sold and resold. And O'Connell didn't grow up in that kind of an enslaved world, but he did know what it was like to grow up feeling inferior in your own country. He did grow up knowing what it was like to feel like you weren't equal in your own country. And it drove him with a determination to secure full rights for Irish people, but also full rights for people who were oppressed around the world. And he didn't limit his sense of what was right by what was just in the interests of Irish people. And that led to fallings out with the Young Irelanders. It led to fallings out with supporters in Irish America. It led to fallings out with other people in Ireland and around the world. But O'Connell did not care. He was uncompromising. He believed that you had to stand up for justice wherever it was denied to people. And I was the organizer of a 250th anniversary conference on Daniel O'Connell in the summer, and Mary McAuliffe spoke brilliantly at it. We had speakers from Ireland and around the world. The Taoiseach spoke. But it wasn't about O'Connell, the historical figure. It was about O'Connell, the human rights champion, and how his words and his message continues to inspire today. We heard from Alexandra Matvichuk, a Ukrainian human rights lawyer whose organization won the Nobel Peace Prize. And she spoke about how O'Connell's cause was their cause in Ukraine. We heard from Keelan Gallagher, very distinguished Irish lawyer practicing in London, a great human rights champion in her own right, who spoke about what's happening in Gaza. And O'Connell would have felt very deeply those two parts of the world, and indeed suffering and oppression that's happening in other parts of the world as well. O'Connell was not a pacifist. O'Connell is sometimes mistakenly viewed in that way, but O'Connell was someone who believed that the country needed to be defended, that it was right to stand up for what you believe in. I think when O'Connell is blamed, he's usually blamed for the cancelling of that meeting in Clontarf. But that went against all his principles. He did not believe that violent revolution was the way forward. And he certainly did not believe in asking the Irish people to head out to Clontarf and walk into a massacre. O'Connell would have died, hundreds, thousands would have died. The country would probably have ignited into open rebellion, but it would have been crushed. And there would have been casualties in the order of hundreds of thousands. And yet some people still cling to that as an act of cowardice, that should have been the 1916 of the 19th century. But I think it was O'Connell's moment of greatest courage, because instead of thinking about his own later reputation, he was putting what were the best interests of the Irish people first. He's also sometimes blamed for something he said about the Irish language. But O'Connell is not to blame for the state the Irish language is in today. O'Connell was never a minister for education in an independent Irish state. O'Connell was someone who deeply loved the Irish language. It was his first language. He conducted law cases in Irish. He sometimes gave big public speeches in Irish, especially if it was a way of confusing the British agents who had gathered to report on it. After the passing of emancipation, he wished he had changed his name to the Irish version because he thought the English O'Connell was an imposition. But O'Connell also admitted that he thought that English was going to be the language of the future, and he believed that it would be necessary for people to know that as well. And because of that comment, he has often been blamed for that. There are many reasons why we can criticize O'Connell. He was by no means a saint. He could be a bully. At times, he could be an egomaniac. He liked when journalists asked him who was the greatest figure in Irish history, and he would say, Henry Grattan, after myself. He loved meeting school children after the passing of emancipation and asking if they knew who he was. And if they didn't, he'd say, I'm the person who won you your freedom. He could be deeply flawed in his personal dealings, in his private dealings, in his financial dealings. He left a legacy of broken friendships, broken deals. He could be highly cynical as a politician. But despite all of that, his genius was the way he was able to raise and inspire an Irish people who had grown up believing that they were a broken down, defeated race. And he convinced them that they were more than slaves and they deserve full rights. And that's why when we talk about O'Connell's great achievements, the great achievement in 1829 was Catholic emancipation. But speaking to people all around the country this year, I realized just how little people actually understand what that actually meant. The O'Connell in 1775, the world that he was born into, was one where Catholics had very little rights, couldn't be educated. O'Connell was forced to go to the continent, couldn't enter the professions. That did ease up in 1793 when Catholics got the vote. Catholics could enter the professions. Catholics could enter Trinity College. But Catholics couldn't be promoted in the law. The great movement of emancipation was more than giving Catholics the right to sit in Parliament, the right to become king's councils and judges, the right to be able to assume these higher legal and political offices. It was essentially about civil rights. It was about Irish people finally feeling that they were equal, that their religion was no longer going to be an obstacle or a block, that they could walk down the street and look other people in the eye. And that's why when O'Connell was elected in County Clare in 1828, that news was telegraphed all around the island by people lighting bonfires, people celebrating. It was the Irish people who gave O'Connell the name Liberator. It was meaningful to them, even though most of them knew that they or their children would never become members of Parliament, might never become king's councils or judges, might never benefit in any of these ways that the Emancipation Act of the following year brought in. They celebrated it because freedom was worth something, something that had been long denied them. And they celebrated it because it meant something on a deeply personal and powerful emotional level. And that's why I have to say I was hugely disappointed when An Phoblacht could not recognise the anniversary of O'Connell's birth and instead decided to republish an article they had first printed in 2019 under the heading about how O'Connell was not our liberator. And they criticised him for cancelling Clontarf and the Irish language, but they couldn't even give him any credit for leading that mass peaceful movement in the 1820s. That everything that O'Connell represented was so anathema to them, they couldn't give him credit for anything. Why? Was it because O'Connell's abhorrence of violence to achieve your ends struck at the heart of their history? I thought it showed a real lack of graciousness and a lack of understanding of our complicated past. O'Connell was not a perfect person, but O'Connell achieved great things for all Irish people and for people around the world. He left a remarkable legacy that is still remembered in the United States, across Europe, in South America, in India, in South Africa. O'Connell showed the world the power of democracy and how the voice of a people united together in a great cause of human and civil rights could never be silenced. O'Connell raised a people who were on their knees, and he convinced them that they were more than slaves. And that's why I think it is right in this anniversary year of his birth that we recognize him as our leader, as our chieftain, and yes, as our liberator.
Thank you, Patrick. And I should say, maybe O'Connell was not an egomaniac, he was simply a Kerry man. Recognising who and what he was. I'm a Kerry woman. Today I want to talk to you about not Daniel O'Connell, but somebody who was very central to his life, his wife, Mary O'Connell. In 1802, Mary O'Connell, yes, she was an O'Connell too, distantly related, married Daniel in secret in Dublin. And this was because she wasn't acceptable to his uncle and the man he was hoping to inherit an estate and money from, Maurice Huntingcap O'Connell. And the question is, why was Mary not acceptable to the O'Connells? Mary O'Dowd and Maria Luddy have done some work on marriage in this period in Ireland, and it really shows that this growing Catholic middle class saw the value of dowries, the importance of inheritance, the status of men and women during this period, particularly from this growing middle classes, showed how particular marriage partners were chosen from a socioeconomic and class status rather than a love match. And the match between Daniel and Mary was a love match. Unusually, Daniel courted Mary in defiance of his uncle Maurice, and Mary responded. He met her in the neutrality of the city here in Dublin, explaining that they could get away with meeting in secret up here because down in Kerry everybody would be watching. And he said, "I've had many more opportunities of seeing and conversing with you than in the prying, curious, busy town of Tralee." Despite all this secrecy, some O'Connell family members knew what was going on, and Mary's sister and brother-in-law did convey letters between the couple, and we have all of those letters, and they demonstrate the depth of emotion between Daniel and Mary. One of the letters said, Maurice O'Connell punished his nephew Luddy said, punished his nephew for secret courtship and marriage by dividing his inheritance, initially intended for Daniel, between him and his brother, with dire consequences for the financial status of Daniel's growing family. And it led to some of those financial embarrassments that he did find himself in later in life. But most of research shows a deep and meaningful love between the couple. Their surviving correspondence, which runs to about 1,000 letters, including 176 that were first published by Mary O'Connell's biographer, Aaron Bishop. Bishop says most historians look at Mary through the lens of her husband's life and work, through her role simply as a wife, not of a person in and of herself. And that's what I want to look at today. I want to look at Mary and see who she was, because she is central to Daniel's life. She is, as he said, "You are the comforter and soother of my cares. My love, you are dearer to me, to my heart, than any woman was to man." Daniel, and indeed Mary, sacrificed money and material wealth for love, even if they both, as Bishop points out later in life, agreed that material wealth was as important as emotional support for a successful marriage. And you can see this when they themselves are conspiring to make advantageous marriages for their numerous offspring later on. And why was Mary willing to sacrifice everything for love? And why was Daniel willing to ensure that they would marry and live their life together? So who was Mary? Well, Mary was born in September 1778 in Tralee in County Kerry. Her father was also an O'Connell, a physician, so they were a member of that growing middle class. He was Church of Ireland, but her mother was Catholic, and of course the girls, as was the tradition of the time, were brought up Catholic. The Tralee Mary was born into was a growing town, a thriving town. New businesses, particularly a grain trade, brought wealth and prosperity to the town. And as a physician, Thomas O'Connell would have been able to provide well for his family. However, he dies in 1785 when Mary is just 7, and the family falls into financial difficulties. These financial difficulties would be the obstacle to the marriage to Daniel because, of course, she didn't have a dowry. However, from the beginning, it is really obvious that Daniel had real and deep feelings. He said, "Believe me, my sweet Mary, I really and truly love you. I'm anxiously awaiting the moment of convincing you of my sincere and fixed regard for you." So Mary agrees to this clandestine relationship. And they marry in 1802, and they manage to keep it secret for a year until, of course, she gets pregnant. And she goes down then, despite the disapproval of the family, to Carnan's house outside Cahersiveen, where she gives birth to the first couple of children in the O'Connell marriage. This was the home where Daniel was born into, near Cahersiveen. It is still there, although in ruins. This was, however, not an easy marriage. As Patrick has talked about, Daniel wasn't an easy person. In the early years, as he concentrated on his legal and political career, there were long separations. And luckily for the historian, they wrote to each other constantly. So we have these volumes of letters between the pair, which give us an insight into the relationship, into their concerns, into their feelings for one another, and into the life of a rising and growing middle-class family, a middle-class woman dealing with that, and a woman married to a very political man. Mary herself was not a political woman. She was not, as you know, historians of gender usually write about political women. They write about, the nuns who were running hospitals or asylums. She was not involved in sex work or prostitution. She didn't concern herself with anything other than domestic, as was expected of a woman of her status and standing. And she was a very busy woman. The letters between them indicate that Mary was very careful with money. Thank goodness somebody was in that relationship. As a supportive wife, she ran their home. She gave birth to 12 children, 7 of whom lived to adulthood. Between 1805 and 1810, she was pregnant almost every year. Between 1812 and 1816, she had 5 more pregnancies, only one of which, her youngest child, Daniel Jr., survived to adulthood. And this was not uncommon for women to have multitudes of children, many of those children not surviving past babyhood. Anyone who knows of Daniel's history, of course, knows of his financial difficulties, and these impacted on the domestic life as well. He bought the house in Merrion Square, even though he couldn't actually afford it. And the letters from Mary's indicated her frustration at the fact that he kept sending people to stay with her. As a public figure, of course, he had to entertain guests in his home, and as a man brought up in the fairly Gaelic tradition of hospitality, he expected his wife would entertain all and sundry, and this led to a lot of frustration from Mary. She had to do this, even though the money really wasn't there for it. But Mary did manage the family finances. She had sons to educate in Clongowes Woods and daughters whose dowries would be necessary if they were to make advantageous marriages. She was very careful with the money. She disapproved of the purchase of Merrion Square. She was aware of the prices and the economic changes, expected value for money, and kept detailed financial accounts of her spending. From 1815 to 1830, when his finances were in dire straits, she ran the household under these circumstances, including closing up the house and going to France for 2 years between 1822 and 24, because it was cheaper to live there than to continue entertaining on such a scale as they were expected to do in Merrion Square. However, having no money meant both had to, she sent her children to school, and she oversaw the growing family. One interesting facet is the education her daughters received. They were educated with Mrs. Bishop, who ran a school in Dublin. Mrs. Bishop, it turns out, was Eliza Wollstonecraft Bishop. You may recognize the name Wollstonecraft. She was actually the sister of the feminist and writer Mary Wollstonecraft. Bishop had suffered abuse from her own husband, and she and Mary fled the house with her newborn baby in 1783. Unfortunately, the child died, but because of the damage to her reputation, Eliza Bishop was never able to remarry and spent most of her life impoverished. Writers on Mary Wollstonecraft see the sisters' flight as crucial to Wollstonecraft's emancipation from male authority and the writing that she would subsequently do. For the Wollstonecraft sisters, unlike Mary O'Connell, without the support of men in their lives, they had to work. And as most middle-class women did at the time, they worked in education. Bishop set up a school in Dublin, and Mary worked for a short time as a governess in Dublin. She writes in her book, The Vindication on the Rights of Women, about the unequal relationships between men and women, including in marriage. We know that Daniel O'Connell read Mary Wollstonecraft's book. It's obviously in his library. And after reading it, he reflected that mind has no sex. Surely the judgment of one sex ought to be as unshackled as that of the other. However, while he voiced rational arguments against prejudice against women, in practice he advocated a more moderate approach, and I suppose that is in common with all his politics, to social reform, and argued that the time was not quite right to improve the female lot. While he welcomed the support of women for Catholic emancipation, and in his anti-slavery campaigns, he viewed women more as a moral force rather than a political force. And as Geraldine Meany has argued, his beliefs were rooted in the special characteristics of what he termed the fairer and better sex, stressing women's familial rather than public roles. And indeed, this is the way the relationship between Daniel and Mary went. He did ask her for advice in their letters, and she spoke to him and gave him advice, but he saw her more as a moral centre of his world rather than a political centre. But one must wonder if Mary also read Wollstonecraft's book and perhaps recognised some of her own domestic difficulties within those pages. Interestingly, despite her dislike of Bishop, and it's obvious she did dislike her, her girls remained at the school for a number of years, and indeed, when another sister, Elvira, set up a boys' school in Hume Street, some of the O'Connell's sons attended there before going to Clongowes. So what have we have to say about Mary O'Connell? She was no public woman. She was no radical like Mary Wollstonecraft, yet neither was she meek, passive, or voiceless. Outside of domestic matters, in letters to her husbands, she expressed her opinion on political events. As Aaron Bishop, her biographer, noted, Mary considered political issues in relation to their impact on those closest to her. She wished for emancipation because its achievement would rid her husband of the troublesome life he led and leave him with more time for the family and more time to be at home. She defended her husband utterly. When anyone attacked him, she went on the attack herself. And she was very upset, particularly at some of his critics, about how cruelly and ungratefully they are acting by you, she wrote. Is it not enough to make you retire in disgust from their service? For Mary, Daniel was the centre of her life. She spent the last few years of her life living with him in London, so we have very few letters from then because they were actually living together. And she comes back to Derrynane in 1833 and dies there, aged 56, very young really, in the October of that year. She's buried in the O'Connell tomb in Abbey, Ireland. Her husband would survive her by just over a decade, and he is buried, despite his wishes to be buried on Abbey Island, not with her, but in Glasnevin Cemetery. Perhaps it is a pity that such a united couple remain buried separately. Their biography of Mary O'Connell was published in 1999 by Aaron Bishop. Perhaps it's now time for a new look at Mary O'Connell and her impact on her husband, Daniel. Thank you.
Hi. So just to echo like points making earlier on, O'Connell was a man of many ways. He was a kind of complicated man, but he was a world figure in his time. In fact, he was the most famous Irish man who was alive. So. Regardless of people's views on him, he is certainly someone who needs to be kind of recognised as a central figure in Irish history. But there are kind of criticisms of him. And I would say that when it comes to kind of criticisms of Daniel O'Connell, that many people's first and probably only experience of it is with James Connolly and his chapter on O'Connell in Labour in Irish history, a chapter of horrors, as Connolly terms it. Now, there are many things that are missed when this is our entry into O'Connell. But for the purposes of this talk, I think that the key issue that is overlooked is Connolly's objective in that chapter and in that book. Connolly's objective in criticising O'Connell was not part of a moral crusade or some kind of personal vendetta. Labour in Irish history is a historical, materialist examination of the actually existing relations of production and exchange in Ireland. His objective was to show the very particular economic class relations that had developed in Ireland as a result of its kind of colonial reality there within the British Empire. And this is an important distinction. When Connolly examines class, and with it Daniel O'Connell, he's not talking about social class, which is how class is usually kind of approached, but economic class relations. And that is a different beast. But because most Irish historians, they approach labour in Irish history as if it is just another historical narrative, forcing it into some kind of Irish Whig historiography of the long march there towards freedom and independence. We miss then entirely the quite significant theoretical innovations and insights that Connolly brought to the table. So when Connolly writes about Daniel O'Connell, he's writing about a figure who was and is a key example of a very particular economic class development that this kind of a very particular economic class dynamic that developed in Ireland in the mid-1700s onwards. R.S. Foster briefly alludes to this in Modern Ireland when he talks of the 1820s and the Catholic middle class ascendancy that was already in the making. The historian, like Kevin Whelan, went one step further in 1995 with his article on Catholic middlemen in 18th century Ireland, calling them an underground gentry. So what James Connolly is doing in Labour in Irish history and in his chapter on Daniel O'Connell, he is examining that mode and its class relations within a colonial framework, one that cannot be seen if your knowledge of capitalism comes only from factories in Manchester and not from the fields of Leinster and the cattle that is grazing on them. And when Connolly did this, starting, there were articles he wrote for the Labour Leader in 1896, he noticed that Ireland had developed a kind of intermediary or middleman class. And this is a different meaning to kind of middleman that is referenced by Whelan, that had wedged themselves there between the economic needs of the British Empire and the economic and human resources of Ireland. This would become known as a comprador class in Marxist theory, and James Connolly, he was a Marxist in the 1920s and the 1930s, but Connolly had recognized this as a very particular kind of colonial class relation in Irish society as early as 1896. So when you start to look at Daniel O'Connell through this lens, as a representative, not just of a Catholic kind of middle class ascendancy who want power for themselves, but as an ascendancy that was tied to the extractive practices of the colonial by capitalism, then O'Connell, his life and his legacy starts to take on a different slant. And if my use of the word by capitalism seems awkward or out of place, I would seriously recommend reading Daniel O'Connell, who was enamored with by capitalism. His writings and speeches on the virtues of the capitalism sing with a poetry and love of capital and finance and industry that not even Adam Smith had attained. O'Connell was, after all, a banker, a monk and other things. When we start seeing O'Connell through this lens, his anti-trade unionism, his anti-working class rights, his refusal to kind of support reform of child labour laws, his hatred and opposition to Chartism, his attacks on Patrick Geoghegan, his support for both the Crown and the British Empire, and his support for kind of repeal of the Corn Laws, the other great kind of repeal movement in O'Connell's life, all of this starts to make sense. O'Connell was a nationalist, but he was a nationalist that wanted self-rule for Ireland within the British Empire and to continue with those kind of colonial extractive practices and objectives that were rampant at the time. As Connolly says in his intro to Labour in Irish history, this Catholic middle class ascendancy had 1,000 economic strings in the shape of investments binding them to English capitalism, as against every sentimental or historic attachment drawing them towards Irish patriotism. O'Connell started losing the kind of support of social reformers in the 1830s. But it was his defense of the ongoing exploitation of children in the textile mills that was, for many of those kind of reformers, the final straw. In 1833, Lord Astley brought in a factory kind of reform bill into the House of Commons. It stated that children working in cotton and woolen industries must be 9 years or above. It then said that children under the age of 18 should only work a maximum of 12 hours a day. O'Connell voted with an amendment to lower the definition of adult in that bill from 18 to 13, meaning that all children over the age of 12 were to be treated as adults in terms of cotton factory work and subject to at least 12 hours a day work. There was a move in 1838 to ensure that these measures were enforced, as there were only 4 factory inspectors for the entire UK, making the law's provisions unworkable. O'Connell rejected this, saying that the amendment was an attempt to introduce a 10 hours bill by stealth, and he was against limiting the working day for adults, with children defined as adults, from the age of 13 onwards. And he also argued that the real problem was the price of bread, stating that mothers were sending their 9-year-old children to work in cotton weaving factories because the price of bread was too high. And so the real solution was not to ban children working in factories, but to lower the price of bread through the free market and repeal of the Corn Laws. Of course, O'Connell and his class didn't want repeal of the Corn Laws simply to lower the price of bread. They wanted them repealed in order to free up land usage from tillage to grazing for the benefit of the cattle ranchers. O'Connell's rejection of the economic interests of the working classes is also seen in his rejection of the right of trade unions to act as trade unions, and that is to combine and go on strike for better pay and work conditions. The legal right to form trade unions had only been granted in 1824, and O'Connell in the 1830s certainly wished for the day when that ban would return. He also challenged Chartism. This movement for working class rights and electoral reform, which owed so much to the genuine innovations made by Daniel O'Connell himself in terms of mass movement protests. And we must hand him his brilliance here. I mean, this was like his methods of organization are the reason why he was a world figure. He genuinely brought something new to the table. It was an absolute brilliance of its time. But Chartism was eventually, and he did start off supporting Chartism, but by the late 1830s, this seems to change, because he saw it as a threat to the social order that he so loved. This was a social order where the interests of capital and factory owners and middle-class landowners and landlords, including O'Connell himself, held sway over the lives of millions of working men, women, and children. On paper, O'Connell should have been a supporter of Chartism. However, he rejected it even when Chartism made repeal of the Act of Union a key demand, as he did in 1842. His attacks on the Irish universal suffrage movement and on Patrick Geoghegan in particular are often described as a clash of like personalities, as are his fights with Fergus O'Connor, who was one of the leaders of like Chartism, an Irishman himself. But these clashes were totally in line with the man's overarching kind of political project, which was to secure Irish middle-class rights, Irish Catholic middle-class rights within the British Empire and no more. There's an argument that's put forward in Irish historiography that the main kind of dividing line in the history of Irish nationalism is between its like constitutional and physical force wings. But the real kind of dividing line, I would argue, is between kind of political kind of nationalism and social question nationalism, with the latter focused on addressing the very particular extractive dynamics that emerged out of Britain's kind of colonial project in Ireland. This clash there between two nationalisms came to a head during the Second Home Rule Bill and the 1913 kind of lockout. And it's 100% clear where O'Connell, he would have stood in that fight in 1913. And it wouldn't have been with James Connolly. It would have been with like William Martin Murphy. Thank you.